In this video on PLO strategy heuristics, I'm going to discuss how to exploit loose passive players. We'll start by looking at what a loose passive player believes. So a loose passive player is readily identified by his inclination to continue with any piece of the board. This behavior arises because his personal flop hand strength evaluation function, which from now I will abbreviate with FEF, is too coarse-grained to be accurate on most flop textures. So what does too coarse-grained mean? Too coarse-grained means that your opponent is going to be selecting categories of hand or subcategories of hand that intersect with the board and treating them as all being similar in strength. So for example, let's say the board is something like a Queen Jack 7. Then he's going to say that any Jack there is more or less the same. Well, perhaps he'll recognize that Jack plus a gut shot is superior to Jack without a gut shot, but he won't recognize the difference in strength between something like Ace Jack 6-5 versus Jack 5-5-3. He will also not recognize the difference on that board between relative value of gut shots. So these types of players tend to want to draw to anything which can beat the current nuts. So you won't recognize that there's a serious risk in drawing to a gut shot that includes 9-8 or even 10-8 versus the ace-king or the ace-10. And remember, with the ace-king or the ace-10, not only do you have the potential to hit a nut gut shot, but you also have the fact that making top pair can again give you top pair plus a gut shot, or at least top pair with the potential to counterfeit or draw out on lower two pairs. And so a loose passive player is just more looking at, do I have some kind of nut draw or do I have some kind of pair? So on a more disconnected board, he's not recognizing the relative value of the side cards. And his continue any piece heuristic is not going to be uniformly inaccurate across all textures facing all opponent strategies. So on some textures he's going to play far worse than others, and his default approach is also going to lose more heavily against opponent strategies which adapt to the precise distortions in his flop evaluation function. So we're going to look at a couple of specific scenarios here, but before we do that, I want to just delve a little bit more deeply into what I mean by the fact that his default approach can lose more heavily against certain opponent strategies, and what I mean by the fact that he's going to play far worse on some flop textures. So a player who is trying to basically hit any piece on boards which are very well connected, at least on the flop, he's going to tend to not be making mistakes against small bets as much as certain tighter players. So imagine the board is something like 8-7-4 with a flush draw. A lot of tight players are very uncomfortable continuing in the big blind there because they're worried about, okay, there can be straights or they can be sets already. So if they've got one pair, they don't really feel like continuing. They might not even feel like continuing with one pair plus a gut shot because they think, well, even if I hit my straight, a flush might hit. Certain weaker flush draws, especially without much support, they don't even want to continue that much because they're worried about, oh, if I continue and then my flush is flush of a flush, then I could be playing a big pot where I'm on a guess and I don't like getting stacked, so let's just play the next hand. And so small bets can actually exploit tight players on these more connected boards because your opponent can see monsters under the bed, if you like. Whereas a loose passive player will tend to just click continue with virtually any piece, and that's going to be correct strategy against a small bet. Conversely, a loose passive player who is going to be continuing in the manner that we're going to see on a couple of the flop textures to come, he can be exploited in a slightly different way. So generally, a player who continues too frequently is going to be doing less badly when the strategy or the intersection of your strategy and the particular flop texture lends itself to being continued on a lot, and he's going to be playing much worse when his response should be to be continuing quite tightly. So if you keep that asymmetry in mind, that can stop you being one of these guys who is constantly playing, especially this happens when people are trying to break from small into mid stakes. They find they're getting low win rates, they can see all their opponents are quote unquote bad, they see these very, very high VPIPs, and they wonder why they're not winning. And basically they're recognizing that in certain situations they're playing better than the fish, but they're a little bit too hesitant to recognize that, first of all, they don't exploit the fish enough, and especially in terms of drawing value, which is the first example today. And secondly, they don't recognize when the fishy strategy of continuing with a wide range is actually correct against the strategy you're playing. So let's look at a couple of examples. The first example of practical exploitation is this. We're going to open from the button, we're going to face a call from a loose passive opponent in the big blind, and the flop is going to be a6-3 trichrome. So a loose passive player will typically lack elasticity in his range, which, if we put that formally, is to say that as we increase our bet size, he will not adjust his flop evaluation function sufficiently. So our best response on this flop, remember we're looking for our best response, we're not looking to try to mindlessly play a strategy that we might pick out of a report that someone else gives us about what a solver says to do on this flop. That's what I would call mindless. At least in 2018. So our best response we're looking for, so how do we maximally exploit our opponent? It is to use a pot size bet with a value heavy range against this player. Now many players fail to do this because they lack a nuanced understanding of card removal. And I can remember encountering this with several of the high stakes players that I've worked with and done private coaching with have made this mistake where they've assumed that if they hold a very strong hand here like top set or top two pair, that necessarily means that if they use a large bet, their opponents will just not have anything to continue with, and so they prefer to bet small in order to get them to continue. Now, there may be merits in adjusting your bet size if you're playing against a competent opponent, but what we're going to see here is that with a player who is relatively inelastic in terms of how he adjusts his flop evaluation function in response to bet size, it's a very bad strategy to underbet. So where's the evidence for this? Let's assume that our opponent's continuing range facing a pot size bet is going to be top pair, any set, any open ender, any six, and then a 3 that doesn't include a pair. Now, it is correct that if we were going to build a perfect continuing range in response to a pot size bet, that would not be it. There are some nuances there in terms of some hands, especially something like King 3, for example, would be missed out there. So there are some under pairs that are going to be better than a 6. There's some merit to continuing certain gut shots here. There's some merits to not continuing some 6s perhaps. But we're going to assume that our opponent's flop evaluation function is not particularly nuanced. That's why he's a loose passive fish. And if we do that, then we can see how the effect of our hand, the cards that we hold in our hand, the blockers or the reverse blockers, affects the frequency with which our opponent can continue. And we see at the top there the King, Queen, Jack 10, so when we have a total miss. Now, this is one subtle point. Not only do we have a miss in terms of not making a pair, but we also have a miss in terms of we do not block our opponents having the relevant straight draw cards here. And we also block him having certain underpairs, despite the fact that those particular underpairs, the kings, the queens, and the jacks, and the tens to some extent, are actually decent continues here, especially if they have a 3 or a 6 alongside. The top set we see, our opponent can continue 46.4% if he uses this range. The top two pair with a gut shot, a very strong hand, he can continue 48.7%. And we see just top pair with a gut shot, where we only intersect by pairing the board once, our opponent can continue 52.4%. And so what we're seeing is because our opponent can hit this flop with a mix of pairs and draws, his continuation frequency actually changes very little when we improve our hand from one pair to two pair or a set. And notice that the equity versus the continuing range for these value hands, the top set of course is at 91%, the top two pair with the gut shot is at 78%, so these are both huge, and even the ace queen 6-5, we've still got a 62% equity edge, which means that we're usually going to be able to bet the turn for value using a fairly large sizing as well. Now, it's worth noting here that the anti-blocker effect of having 4 cards which make neither a pair nor a straight draw does make it much more likely the big blind has hit the flop. So actually, an anti-blocker effect on a board like this is way more important than actually intersecting with the board. And so this is why, if you're somebody who likes to c-bet a lot, you can actually run into trouble yourself against loose passive players by just c-betting total air on this board, maybe with your default smaller sizing, but c-betting total air on this board, and then finding that your opponent is frustratingly continuing quote-unquote too wide, but actually you're just value cutting yourself because his incorrect flop evaluation function against somebody who c-bets too much becomes correct, right? So a lot of you, the underlying reason why you find you can't win or you can only break even for long stretches is because you actually play into your opponent's hands as much as you exploit them. And that is to do with your opponent's evaluation function, which is what we're really building towards in these series. So let's look at another scenario. So let's say again we open from the button, we face a call from a loose passive opponent in the big blind, and the flop this time is King, King 3 trichrome. So a loose passive player will continue in the hand with hands which have a chance to beat obvious strong hands. The problem is for him on this paired board, only pairs can outdraw a king. So our best response on this flop is actually going to be more similar to what you would expect if you were searching for a game theory optimal strategy, which would be to use a small bet with a bluff. Well, obviously optimal wouldn't be bluff heavy, but in terms of sizing it would be, to use a small bet with a bluff heavy range against this player. Now many players avoid bluffing loose passive players here because they mistakenly assume that call any piece means that their opponents continue with a wide range regardless of the flop texture. So this is actually a spot where it's very easy for a loose passive player to fold too frequently. So we see here the frequencies in this table which are calculated for when the button does not hold a king. So fairly obviously card removal is a big deal on a paired board because it's not so much like when you do have trips in terms of blocking the non-trip hands, but like when you don't hold trips, the probability that your opponent does hold trips goes materially up, especially if you've got 4 cards that don't even pair the bottom card as well. So here, what we see is that if our opponent is playing very, very tight, so he just wants to play trips, full houses, and decent-sized pairs, well, then he's going to be folding too much even if he's a pot-size bet, bluntly. But then when we expand that out to him having any pair or any overpair of 4s or above, he gets up to about 58%, so still we're going to be comfortably showing a profit with every single bluff when we bet small there, if that's his continuing range, irrespective of whether he includes a check-raising range, right? We've passed the minimum threshold. If you're not familiar with the minimum threshold and you'd like that explained to you, please mention it in the comments. So I'm going to be assuming a certain baseline knowledge in these videos, and if the audience that's watching this would like some more simple concepts explained, you're welcome to ask me. Sometimes I have something that's very thoroughly explained, especially pre-flop. I'll just direct you to my paid courses. But certain concepts, if I think it's basic, but I've made a mistake of assuming too much knowledge, then please just say, and I'll do what I can to help you out there. If we go down to the 64.6% row, we see that now you're getting up to the point where you start adding in the pocket deuces as well and some ace high hands, and we get up to 72% once we hit something ace queen, ace jack, and ace 10. When we don't hold a king, the big blind will hold trips 21% of the time, trips or better. So the problem with a large flop bet here is that our bluffs would then have to take our loose passive opponent off of trips by the river. And of course, loose passive opponents, another defining feature is they tend not to fold strong hands in terms of their absolute strength once they make them. And so it's very easy to lose money here by betting big on the flop with a bluff and then giving up because the fish won't fold. So sometimes you might bet, let's say, a bit bigger here on the flop as a bluff, and then maybe a queen or a jack comes and you start thinking, okay, I'll follow through on the turn with my pair of queens, my pair of jacks, and he calls again, and then you think, well, he's obviously got a decent hand here, the only way I can win is by trying to bluff him, and then you pot on the river thinking you're quote-unquote obviously repping a full house, and he snap calls you with whatever king he has, and you wonder why on earth you just gave the fish a large fraction of your stack. And so once you've experienced that a few times, what you might do is bet a bit big on this flop, and then as soon as the fish calls, you just shut down, and that's also an inferior strategy because what you need to be doing in the first place is betting small enough so that his flop evaluation function would lead him to behave in a very minus EV fashion by overfolding. So what did we learn today? A loose passive player has a flop hand strength evaluation function which is too coarse grained to be accurate on most flop textures. He looks for hands which can make nut or near nut hands and does not vary his continuing range enough as his opponent's bet size changes. Our best response on a low persistence flop against this player is to use a pot size bet with a value heavy range. Our best response on a high persistence flop is to use a small continuation bet with a bluff heavy range. I'm Phil Rockmore, the founder and research director at CardQuant Limited. Please like this video if you want to see more videos on PLO strategy heuristics. Thanks for watching. Good luck at the tables.